I want you to imagine something for a second. It's a Tuesday morning. Not a public holiday. Not a weekend. Just a regular Tuesday. And instead of sitting in traffic, or logging into a work call you didn't want to be on, or checking your phone before you've even had coffee, you just don't. You wake up when your body decides it's ready. You make breakfast slowly. Maybe you go for a walk. Maybe you don't. The point is, nobody is waiting on you. No deadline. No performance review. No manager. That image, that feeling, is what most people are actually chasing when they say they want to retire early. It's not really about the money. It's about ownership. Owning your time. But here's the thing. Most people either think that kind of life is only possible for the ultra-wealthy, or they've heard the phrase, retire early, and immediately pictured someone who gave up everything, lived on nothing, and sacrificed their entire 30s to make it happen. And neither of those stories is quite right. There's actually a framework, a remarkably simple one, that financial researchers worked out decades ago that tells you, with reasonable confidence, whether you have enough money to stop working. Or at least, stop working because you have to. It's called the 4% rule. And I think once you understand it properly, it genuinely changes how you see money, saving, and what enough actually means. I'm Finn, welcome back to Finley Invest. Now before I explain how the 4% rule works, I want to address something. Because I think a lot of people hear the words, retire early, and immediately feel one of two things. Either they feel excited, like this is finally the answer they've been looking for. Or they feel a quiet kind of guilt, like wanting to stop working is somehow lazy or selfish or not realistic for someone like them. And I get that. I really do. We've grown up in a culture that ties your identity to your job, where the first question at any dinner party is, so, what do you do? And where taking your foot off the accelerator feels like you're falling behind. But here's what I want you to consider. Retiring early doesn't necessarily mean never working again. For most people who actually pursue financial independence, it means getting to a point where work becomes a choice rather than a necessity, where you could stop if you wanted to, where a bad boss, a redundancy, a health scare, none of those things have the power to derail your entire life. That's a different kind of security to what most people are building toward. And the misunderstanding I see most often is this. People think financial independence requires an extraordinary income, or some kind of lucky break, or an obsessive frugality that makes life miserable. But the 4% rule reveals something much quieter and more democratic than that. It tells you that the relationship between your savings and your freedom is actually something you can calculate, right now, on a piece of paper. So let's get into it. The 4% rule came out of something called the Trinity Study, a piece of research done in the late 1990s by 3 finance professors in the United States. They looked at historical stock and bond market data going back decades and asked a very specific question. If a retiree withdrew a certain percentage of their portfolio every year across different market conditions, crashes, booms, recessions, what withdrawal rate gave them the best chance of not running out of money over a 30-year retirement? And the answer they landed on was roughly 4%. What that means in practice is this. If you have a diversified investment portfolio and you withdraw no more than 4% of its total value in your first year of retirement, then adjust that amount slightly each year for inflation, historically, your portfolio has had a very strong chance of lasting at least 30 years. Without you ever having to work again. That's the core idea. Now let me make that concrete because I think numbers are where this really clicks. If you have $500,000 invested, 4% of that is $20,000 a year, or about $1,667 a month. If you have $1 million invested, 4% is $40,000 a year. If you have $1,500,000 invested, that's $60,000 a year. And before you say, well, I'll never have $1 million, stay with me for a moment. Because the number that matters here isn't actually your portfolio balance first. It's your annual expenses. The 4% rule works backwards just as powerfully as it works forward. And this is where it gets genuinely useful for figuring out your own number. Here's the question you actually need to answer. How much does your life cost per year? Not how much you earn. How much your actual life, rent or mortgage, food, transport, utilities, subscriptions, leisure, all of it, costs you to run each year. Let's say, for example, your lifestyle costs $40,000 a year to maintain. That's roughly $3,300 a month, which for a lot of Australians is a pretty reasonable, modest but comfortable life. Maybe you rent, you're not splashing on business class flights every month, but you're not white-knuckling it either. If you need $40,000 a year to live, and you can safely withdraw 4% from your portfolio annually, then the portfolio size you need is simply $40,000 divided by 0.04, which gives you $1 million. That's your number. Your freedom number. Now here's the version of that calculation that really makes people stop and think. If your annual expenses were $30,000 a year, you've made some intentional choices about where you live, you don't have a car payment, your lifestyle is reasonably lean, your freedom number drops to $750,000. And if your expenses sit around $50,000 a year, you need $1,250,000. What this tells you is something fascinating about the relationship between spending and freedom. It's not just about how much you earn or how aggressively you invest. The size of your life, what you spend, directly determines how much capital you need to sustain it. Every dollar you permanently trim from your annual expenses doesn't just save you that dollar. It reduces the investment target you need to hit. There's a concept in the financial independence world sometimes called the multiplier effect of frugality, and the 4% rule makes it visible in a really concrete way. If you spend $1,000 less per year, maybe you cancel a few subscriptions, cook at home more, downsize your car, that doesn't just save you $1,000. It reduces your freedom number by $25,000. That's not a small thing. Now, there are some important caveats here, and I want to be straight with you about them because I think intellectual honesty is more useful than blind optimism. The Trinity Study was conducted using U.S. market data, and it assumed a 30-year retirement horizon, which made sense for people retiring in their mid-60s. If you're thinking about stopping work at 45, you might be looking at a 40 or 50-year retirement. Some researchers argue you'd want to be a little more conservative in that scenario, somewhere between 3% and 3.5% withdrawal, to give yourself more buffer. Sequence of returns risk is also real. That's the risk that if the market drops significantly in the early years of your retirement, and you're still withdrawing money, it can meaningfully reduce how long your portfolio lasts compared to someone who retired into a bull market. It's not a reason to dismiss the 4% rule, but it's a reason to have a plan, some flexibility, maybe a small amount of part-time income in the early years, or a slightly larger buffer built in. And of course, in Australia, superannuation adds an interesting layer. Depending on your age and when you can access it, your super might kick in later and significantly reduce the private investment balance you actually need to bridge the early retirement years. That's worth thinking through carefully with your own situation in mind. But none of those caveats break the core insight of the framework. They just add nuance. And nuance is good. Here's the thing that shifted for me when I really sat with this concept. Most people approach their finances with a vague, open-ended goal. I want to save more. I want to be comfortable. I want to retire, eventually. And there's nothing wrong with those intentions, but they're not targets. They're feelings. The 4% rule gives you a target, a real, calculable, specific number. And having a number changes your relationship with money in a surprisingly psychological way. It moves you from operating out of anxiety, that nameless, low-grade worry that you don't have enough and never quite will, to operating out of direction. You're not just saving because it's responsible. You're saving because you're building toward something you can actually name. Think about the difference between running on a treadmill in the dark, not knowing how far you've gone or how much is left, versus running toward a visible finish line where you can see exactly how far away it is. Same effort, completely different mental experience. And I'll say this, it's not just about the day you actually stop working. It's about what happens to your psychology as you get closer to that number. There's research suggesting that people who feel financially secure, not necessarily rich, just secure, experience meaningfully lower levels of chronic stress. They sleep better. They make calmer decisions in their relationship. They're less likely to stay in situations, jobs, living arrangements, even relationships, that aren't serving them, simply because they feel financially trapped. The 4% rule, in a roundabout way, is a map toward that kind of freedom. And you don't have to be at the destination to start feeling its effects. So what can you actually do with this information? The first thing is simply to figure out your annual expenses honestly. Not aspirationally. Not the number you wish it was. The actual number. Go back through 3 months of bank statements and add it up. Most people find this either mildly confronting or genuinely surprising, sometimes both. But you cannot navigate without knowing where you currently are. Once you have that number, multiply it by 25. That's the mathematical equivalent of the 4% rule run in reverse. It tells you your rough financial independence number. Write it down somewhere. Put it somewhere you'll actually see it. That's your finish line. Then, start thinking honestly about the gap. How far are you from that number right now? And what's a realistic, sustainable pace at which you could close it? Not an extreme pace. Not a give up your social life and eat rice pace. A pace that you could actually maintain for a decade without burning out or resenting the process. For a lot of people, this is where index fund investing becomes the quiet hero of the story. Regular contributions into a diversified portfolio over a long enough time horizon, with compound growth doing the heavy lifting. That's the engine that closes the gap. The 4% rule is the destination. Consistent investing is the vehicle. And if early retirement isn't your goal, if you actually love your work and have no desire to stop, the 4% rule still gives you something valuable. It gives you the number at which work is optional. And optional is a very different feeling to mandatory. I want to leave you with this. That Tuesday morning I described at the start, the one where nobody is waiting on you, where the day is yours. That isn't a fantasy reserved for people who got lucky or made extraordinary sacrifices. For a lot of people, it's a mathematical destination. One that has a number, a path, and a time frame. You might be 10 years away from it. You might be 20. You might already be closer than you think, or you might have some real ground to cover. But the point is, it's knowable. And knowable is so much better than the alternative of just hoping things will somehow work out. Progress is not linear. Life gets expensive. Markets wobble. Plans change. That's just reality. But having a framework, even an imperfect one, gives you something to orient toward. And orientation, I think, is underrated as a source of calm. You don't have to be perfect with money. You just have to be moving in the right direction with a reasonable map in your hand. That's enough. Thanks for spending some time with me today. If this gave you something to think about, I'd love to know what your number is. Leave it in the comments, or just let me know what landed for you. And if you know someone who could use a calmer way of thinking about retirement and financial independence, feel free to share this one with them. Take care of yourself. I'll see you in the next one.